Hello, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, coming to you today from the University of Philippines in beautiful Los Baños. Merry Christmas, everybody. I want to use this opportunity to talk to you about something that concerned a lot of us for the past 10, 14 days. The sanctions that were taken against my countryman, Jacques Beau, against Nathalie Yamp, also a Swiss citizen, against Hussein Dogru, a German citizen in Germany, and overall 59 people who now have been put on the sanctions list by the EU, and who, if they are living inside the EU or if they still have any kind of considerable connection to the EU, have now completely different lives than before. They cannot open bank accounts. They cannot have bank accounts. All of their funds are frozen. They are not allowed to buy things. They're not allowed to sell things. They're not allowed to receive gifts. Hussein Dogru, who's a German citizen living in Germany, needs to ask for special permission, humanitarian permission, to even pay rent for his house. As a matter of fact, all of these payments for his house and so on are being done by going through his wife, whose accounts also have been affected by this horrible regime, because, as it turns out, it's not just the sanctions that are biting, not just what is directly mandated by the EU, but a lot of these institutions, like banks and airlines and so on, they all implement sanctions much wider than they have to, just to be on the safe side, just to be sure that they are not going to have any repercussions. That is the long arm of the sanctions. It goes so far that even in Switzerland, which is not part of the European Union, banks will at least partially implement these sanctions. And other institutions might implement these sanctions just to stay on the safe side. These 59 individuals, if they are the people who are residing outside the EU, the people who are living in the global south, including in Russia or China, they will of course manage. They will get by. On them, this is not as hard as it is on others. But for those who are living in the EU, like my countryman, Jacques Beau, who's living in Belgium, for him, and his entire life is now changed. And the really draconian measures have been a topic now, luckily, for about 2 weeks. I just want to say one thing. The Jacques Beau, he's really not the only one. He now blew up Twitter because his case is so outrageous. But Nathalie Yamp, the other Swiss who was already sanctioned in June, she is stranded outside of Switzerland. She's stranded in Africa. Luckily, she has connections there, and luckily she's also able to somehow get by. But still, the kind of restrictions that are put on these people is draconian. And I need to point out one thing, because a lot of people try to make sense of this in one way or another by pointing to the lack of judicial due process, the lack of all kind of standards of judicial care, right, that you would expect from a punishment this hard. The sad matter of the fact is, sanctions are not actually punishment. They are, and I'll read this out to you from the actual homepage of the European Union, if I can just find it. You know how the European Union itself describes these draconian measures that end people's lives as they knew it. Let me just read this. This is from the official homepage of the European Union about the sanctions. All restrictive measures adopted by the EU are fully compliant with obligations under international law, including those pertaining to humanitarian aid, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. So they're already telling you that no, everything is fine. There's nothing to see here. There's no infringement of human rights. Of course there's infringement of human rights. But get this, when it comes to what these sanctions are not punitive, and instead seek to bring about a change in the policy or conduct of those targeted, with a view to promoting the objectives of the EU's common foreign and security policy. Now, this is why these sanctions circumvent all and any usual standard of judicial care, because they're not judicial measures. They're executive measures. They're in fact educational, or they're educational measures. The EU is telling you that you did something that we don't like, and we're now going to educate you. We're going to tell you how you should adopt your behavior, because these individuals didn't do anything illegal. Jacques Beau didn't do anything illegal. Jacques Beau didn't break a law. He just did something in a way that the European Union doesn't appreciate, and therefore the European Union is now trying to take disciplinary measures. So that's also why it is so difficult to fight this approach through the judicial process, because the most courts in Europe are not actually competent to deal with it. It falls outside of what they usually deal with, just because these sanctions are taken based upon what in international law and international relations is called sovereign right. The idea that states, when it comes to their external affairs, can take measures as they please. They don't need to ask anyone. Sometimes we mistakenly think that governments go to the United Nations in order to, apply for something, or that the United Nations regulates what states can and cannot do, and that states need to adhere to that. And while in theory that is true, while in theory the United Nations has the capacity of generating international law, in practice, what states do when they want to take measures to the outside world is they base it upon their sovereign right. They are the largest, they're the ultimate lawgiver when it comes to their territory. Therefore, they take the right of making law. So the sanctions are in this sense a sovereign measure of the European Union saying what's going to happen inside the EU. Now, of course, the EU is not actually a nation state, at least not a classic one. The EU is a very actually fascinating project that is now going horribly wrong, of member states that gave certain powers up in the Treaty of Lisbon, in other international treaty instruments, and delegated these powers to the European Union. One of these powers is this common foreign and security policy. So the sad thing is that what they did, levying sanctions against institutions, against companies and individuals, is legal in the sense that it is formally correctly done. It is the formal legality of these sanctions is given because the European Union kept to its own process internally that it structured and laid out in order to levy them. Now, that doesn't mean that the content of the sanctions is also adhering to legal norms and standard. On the contrary, the substance itself is not only highly problematic, it is, and I'm absolutely sure about this, in contradicting human rights law, and under certain circumstances, maybe even humanitarian law, although probably rather not, but human rights law for sure. And if you challenge this in front of a human rights court, I am pretty certain these individuals will win. The problem they have in order to bring this to a human rights court is that under the standards of these courts, be it within the United Nations or outside, you must first take all possible remedies on a local level. And the local level actually grants one remedy, and that is the European Court of Justice. So these 59 individuals can appeal to the ECJ and say like, hey, we want a review of our case. But in the end, the ECJ then, what it actually checks is highly unclear to me. Whether it just checks the form, whether the formal requirements are kept, or whether it also checks on the substance of the matter. Because you've seen probably how flimsily constructed these claims are, right? There's a tiny little paragraph, about 6-7 lines long, on each of these individuals on why they're being put on this sanctions list. Now, whether the content of that is true or not actually doesn't really matter that much, because the European Union has the right to put anyone on this list for any kind of reason out of sovereign right. That's the draconian and horrible thing. It's because it's not a judicial process. It doesn't need to adhere to judicial norms. It must only adhere to the internal formal norms of formulating such sanctions. Naturally, the sanctions were officially not designed for this. They were not meant to be targeted inward. They're meant as a foreign policy tool. And what we are witnessing is, of course, the deterioration of any kind of adherence to standard norms when it comes to foreign policy. And it is, sadly enough, something that is expected. Any kind of totalitarian system or going totalitarian system, increasingly becoming totalitarian system, any one of those, at some point will need to point the policies and weapons that are usually meant to guard the system toward the outside, needs to point it inward. And that's what we are seeing. And I just want to also mention that while this is new to Europeans, or Schengen area members like Jacques Beau, Nathalie Yamb, Switzerland is inside Schengen, the common area where people can freely travel, but outside the European Union. What is new is that these sanctions are being used as tools to target individuals inside the EU. They have for a long time actually been used to target people outside. Nathalie Yamb told me in an interview that I did with her and that we will find on this channel from a few days ago, that Africans are very used to being put on EU or US sanctions lists for no crime other than opposing EU colonial policies or the colonial policies of some EU states like France, like Belgium, like, maybe not Belgium, sorry, scrap that, but especially France. The UK has a track record of this, the United States has a track record of this, of using these foreign policy tools to target activists, activists in Africa who are trying to get rid of the neo-colonial remnants of what this still system of abuse and extraction is, where the wealth of Africa is being basically taken for nearly free by Western companies. And there have been, for decades, you've had people who've been trying to fight this. But for decades, these Western states have been using sanctions to target especially the leaders of any kind of such movement. Naturally, the next step after this, if sanctions fail, is what states do, is they levy terrorism charges against people. And we are really at this point only one step away from the EU designating individuals as information terrorists or whatever other kind of phrase you want to come up with in order to use even harsher policing measures against them. Right now, we're at a state where the EU is trying to get rid of voices it doesn't like by basically denial of service or denial of any service, of making these people outlaws. That's already horrible enough. The next stage will be to proactively persecute them, right? To send out the police forces, maybe the military forces, in order to apprehend people. We are not there yet, and I pray that we don't go that route, but it is what systems that spiral into totalitarianism are doing. So the sad matter of the fact is that the European Union is able to circumvent even the entire law process of member states, and it is using executive power to crack down. And it's not doing so as part of a legal mechanism. It's doing so as part of the governing process of the entire construct. And that is, Adolf Hitler at some point just declared that the acts that his government did were legal. They were called Ermächtigungsgesetze, that you just take the power and you just declare that things are legal. The EU is by no stretch of the imagination yet at that point. But it is highly problematic that such actions are being taken. So don't take me wrong. The EU is not a Nazi state yet, but it needs to stop doing this. Now, that brings me to maybe the last point, which is what can we do? These are essentially political measures, and political measures cannot be fought, or can only can be fought with judicial processes only in a very difficult way. And while these individuals who are now sanctioned must actually take legal action and try to get some of their basic human rights back, what we need to do is we need to start a political process. We need to call this out, and luckily on Twitter, the Jacques Beau case is now being discussed very much. I am very happy about that. We need to discuss it further. We need to talk about it. We need to send letters, petitions. We need to make it clear to the EU leadership that this is one bridge too far and that it will not be accepted, including political demonstrations. And in Switzerland, maybe we have to think about forcing our government to protect our rights toward the European Union with a popular referendum. That would be a route. So we need to take political action. Judicial action cannot fight a political system of repression. So the other thing is stand together. I mean, connect with others, create support groups, create support mechanisms for people who land on the sanctions regime. Because if the European Union doesn't actually get it, that it needs to stop this, otherwise it undermines everything it stands for. If it doesn't get that, then this repression regime will get worse. And more people are going to land on that list, and more lives will be upended. So what we need to do is to create mechanisms to at least help somehow in these circumstances. One of the first ones, gathering in online forums, exchanging information, legal advice from lawyers, from judges who do not agree, to give advice of what can be done to mitigate the worst of the effects. But to get rid of this, that can only be done through political action in various ways. So with these thoughts, I'm going to leave you from the University of the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, where I must say life still feels free. Life still feels very much unhindered. And I will see you from back in Japan very soon. Goodbye.